Hi there, and welcome to Excel VBA Programming, the complete guide. My name is Boris Pascaver, and I'm a software engineer based in New York City, and I'm really excited to introduce you to one of the most powerful tools available in the Microsoft Office ecosystem, Visual Basic for Applications. So what is Visual Basic for Applications? Visual Basic for Applications, also known by the popular acronym VBA, is an object-oriented programming language. Now, if you're unfamiliar with programming, if you've never written a line of code before, if the term object-oriented is unfamiliar to you, that's totally fine. This course is designed for complete beginners. All you need is a little bit of basic Excel knowledge. With that said, we know from popular culture that programming is the idea of giving instructions to the computer, a sequence of steps for the computer to follow in order to execute some kind of task. When it comes to VBA, VBA is used to automate tasks in Microsoft Office applications like Excel, Word, PowerPoint, Access, Outlook, and more. VBA consists of snippets of code that we call procedures or macros. Some people also call them subroutines, routines, or programs, all essentially different names for the same thing. But all of these snippets of code are just sequences of steps. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. Step 3, do this. Imagine that you have a real-life scenario where you want to explain to a coworker how to perform some kind of process in Excel, like modifying a daily report. You might call them over and say, the first thing I need to do is to highlight all of the headers in our top row and make them bold. Then change the font to this font, change the font size to this, perhaps add a border. Next, at the bottom of the worksheet, I want to perform a sum calculation on all of the columns. Perhaps after that, I want to add a chart or a table or a pivot table, and then let's say replicate this entire process across multiple worksheets, across multiple workbooks. The exact same way that you describe this Office process to a coworker is the exact same way that we're going to describe it to VBA. We're just going to use a different syntax, a different language in order to communicate with the computer. But anything that you can do in Excel in the main interface, you can tell VBA to do with code. So what can VBA help you do in Excel? Well, VBA is really great at repetition. It can help you perform the exact same operation on multiple spreadsheets or multiple workbooks or multiple rows. Whenever you need to execute a repetitive sequence of steps, let's say you run a report daily or weekly or monthly or every hour, whenever you find yourself doing the exact same process over and over again, you can write a macro that's going to automate the process of completing all those steps in order. VBA can also help you to create brand new Excel functions to use in the main Excel application. By default, Excel 2016 includes over 400 functions, but perhaps you need a custom function for your project or your business needs or your company. You can actually use VBA to create brand new Excel functions. You can also use VBA to react dynamically to events like user interactions. What do I mean by user events? Well, imagine things like the user opening a workbook, or creating a brand new worksheet, or even entering or deleting a value in a cell. All of these things are called events. They shoot off at a given moment in time when something occurs. We can actually use VBA to dynamically react to those events, to do something when they occur. For example, we can trigger a workbook to save whenever the user enters a value into a cell. We can also use VBA to render custom user interfaces. We call these things user forms, and they resemble very much like a real-life web form where we have inputs. We may have radio buttons or buttons to click or checkboxes to check. And after the user completes the user form, we can take the data that they provided and use it to modify the worksheet somehow. It's a really great approach for reducing the total amount of errors that the user can commit and asking them to submit their data in a much more controlled environment. Finally, although it's not covered in the course, VBA can also be used to communicate between different Office applications. So for example, if you want to use Outlook, the email app, to send an email to every single email that's listed, let's say, in a spreadsheet, you can do that. And although this course doesn't cover cross-app communication, as soon as you understand the basics of how VBA works in Excel, it's a lot easier to apply this concept to other Office apps and especially make them communicate with each other. So why learn VBA? Well, as I mentioned, VBA reduces the redundancy of your Excel workflow. Just about everybody uses Excel from time to time, whether it's for professional reasons or for personal reasons like calculating your personal finances or even calculating sports statistics. Microsoft Office is installed on over 750 million computers worldwide. So Excel is a really, really popular spreadsheet application, the most popular one in the world, and it's highly likely you're going to be working with it from time to time. So why not pick up a skill that's going to help make you more productive and more automated within it? VBA will grow your technical skills as a general Excel user and as a business analyst. If you've reached a threshold in your knowledge of Excel, if you're wondering what's the next best thing that I can pick up within this application to make me a more productive employee, VBA is undoubtedly the #1 answer. There is no other tool available within any Office application that will give you as much power as VBA. VBA also offers an excellent introduction to computer programming in a familiar work environment. Now, I mentioned earlier that you don't have to know anything about programming to start this course. If you were interested in learning programming for the first time and you picked up another language outside of VBA, you usually have to learn a lot of things to get started. You have to learn the context in which the language operates. You might have to pick up a brand new text editor. It's a lot harder to get started with something from scratch. The great thing about VBA is that most users have at least some basic knowledge of Excel, how we enter values, how we enter functions, the general purpose of a spreadsheet, and because you have that pre-existing knowledge, you have a really strong foundation, and a lot of the complicated things that you'd have to learn in other programming languages, you don't have to learn here. You can just focus on the brand new concepts within the context of something that is already very familiar to you. Finally, VBA remains a valuable skill in today's job market. Microsoft itself has said that VBA will be around in Windows versions of Excel through 2036. That's 20 years from now. So this isn't going anywhere. It's here to stay, and it's used a lot across many different industries, including finance. So it's an incredibly valuable skill, but even if you don't work with Excel in your day-to-day job, it's an incredibly amazing thing that you can pick up as a general Excel user. I want to take a brief moment here to discuss the history of VBA. VBA is a modern dialect of a language called BASIC that goes back all the way to the 1960s. The two are completely different languages. VBA is just inspired by the syntax and logic of BASIC. That's what we mean by modern dialect. In 1991, Microsoft released the Visual Basic programming language for Windows. That's also a completely separate language that's used to build standalone desktop applications on Windows. So the important thing that I want to emphasize here is that BASIC, Visual Basic, and Visual Basic for applications are three completely different things. In 1994, Microsoft released the first version of VBA, Visual Basic for applications, with Excel 5. So again, VBA was inspired by Visual Basic, which itself was inspired by BASIC, but VBA can only be used within the context of existing Office applications. It can't be used to develop something outside of an Office application. So key takeaway, both VB and VBA are inspired by BASIC, but they are completely different languages. I also want to provide a really cool throwback here. This is actually what Excel looked like back in 1995, the very first version in which VBA was introduced. As I look at this, I'm kind of surprised because as much as it looks a little bit dated aesthetically, some of the things are not as stylish as they are in today's version of Excel. What I'm really most surprised by is how much things haven't changed. I feel like if I had to dive back into this version of Excel and use it for my day-to-day spreadsheet needs, I don't think it would be that difficult to just go into this one and use it as well. So it's really cool to observe how 20 years of Excel development have led us here, but how a lot of those common elements remain the same, even in this piece of software that is almost 20 years old. Alright, so let's dive into the prerequisites for the course. Before I dive into the technical requirements, I want to really emphasize the importance of participation and experimentation. No matter how many tutorials you watch, there really is no substitute for writing code yourself. You have to be willing to try out different things yourself. You have to be willing to make mistakes. You have to be willing to deal with the frustration of running into a bug and having to Google it and reading responses on Stack Overflow and the like. No matter how effective a course is, no matter how many video tutorials or quizzes or assignments there are, the single best way to learn is to try things out yourself. So I strongly recommend, regardless of your Excel knowledge or your programming knowledge, whenever you watch a video in this course, copy the code alongside in your own version of Excel. Make sure you're not just watching, make sure you're participating, and then after the video is done, try out something different. Try an alternate syntax. Don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to run into bugs. That's the quickest way to learn. Now, as far as the technical requirements, you do need a working copy of Microsoft Excel. The good news is that VBA is pre-installed with Excel, so if Excel is working on your computer, there's nothing more that you need to install or to purchase or to configure. We're all good to go. For this course, I strongly recommend Excel 2016 for Windows. As of right now, at the end of 2017 and the beginning of 2018, when this course is being recorded, this is still the latest version of Excel. Backwards compatibility issues are always possible. This won't be an issue with different versions of Windows, but may be an issue with different versions of Excel. So if you have a more dated version of Excel, especially something really old like 2003 or 2007, versions that are more than a decade old, I do recommend investing a little bit and getting the most recent version. It is worth the upgrade. There are a lot of brand new features introduced, and that will ensure the least likelihood for running into errors and backwards compatibility issues as you proceed throughout the course. I want to point out that Excel for Mac is not supported. As much as Microsoft has tried, there are still a lot of major staggering differences between the Windows version and the Mac version. The Mac version really isn't great for VBA. It has a slightly different interface, and it's just too much of a challenge to have to deal with two different videos to do the exact same thing on two different platforms. In addition, Microsoft also offers Excel on things like iPad and iPhone and an Office web app in your browser, but none of those versions support VBA, so they're also not covered by the course. For this course, I also recommend an intermediate knowledge of Excel. I don't want to put any strict constraints on you. I don't want to say things like you need to know this function or this number of functions or this functionality. But essentially all this means is this won't be your first time using Excel. You should have some familiarity with this application, with what it's used for, with some of its most common functionalities. You should know how to change basic things like the font size, how to navigate across different spreadsheets, how to open workbooks and save them. Those basic common beginner operations should all be very comfortable to you. I do recommend a general knowledge of really common functions like SUMIF, COUNTIF, and VLOOKUP. This will come really handy. And, of course, a little bit of experimentation with things like pivot tables, charts, and graphs. You don't have to know every detail. You don't have to know how to create, two axes on a graph or all of the nitty-gritty details of a pivot table, but just a little bit of familiarity with these things. If you've never played around with any of these Excel features, I do recommend spending some time with a general Excel course before diving into VBA. VBA deals with interacting with a lot of these existing Excel functionalities, so if you don't know them, it's going to be hard to write code to deal with them. Finally, I recommend a basic knowledge of data types. So you should be able to know the difference between a number and text, or even as a more complicated example, between an integer versus a floating point number. The more data types you know, for example, dates or booleans, or in programming terms, things like arrays, the easier the course will be to pick up for you. But again, as I mentioned, you don't need any concrete knowledge of programming to get started. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. I'm really excited to teach you how to use VBA. It's one of the most powerful things you can learn within an Office application to help you automate your workflow. I really hope you're excited as well. And in the next lesson, we'll begin our journey into VBA by enabling the Developer tab within Excel, which will allow us to actually interact with Visual Basic for applications. Hope you're excited, and I'll see you there. Alright, so I know you're excited to dive into VBA, but before we get there, there are a couple things we need to configure within Excel. The first thing we need to do is to enable something called the Developer tab on our ribbon. Now, as a review, the ribbon is what we call the main Excel menu. This thing up here is what we call the ribbon. The ribbon consists of several tabs, for example, Home, Insert, Page Layout, Formulas, etc. And each tab is made up of groups. Groups are just collections of related commands. For example, here on the Insert tab, I have the Tables group, the Illustrations group, the Add-ins group, and so on. On the ribbon, we also have this File option, which takes us into something called the Backstage Window view. Right here, we can do a couple extra Excel-related functionalities like opening and saving a workbook, printing, and more. Whenever we want to come back to the main Excel interface with the ribbon, we just click this arrow, and that takes us back to the ribbon. So there is a primary tab that we use for working with VBA, but unfortunately it's disabled by default. It's hidden. I think the reason for this is that Microsoft assumes that the majority of people will not be using VBA in their workbooks, so they feel like it clutters up the main ribbon. The first thing we need to do is to actually enable it on our ribbon. As a heads up, throughout the course, I'm going to be zooming in on content from time to time, whether it be VBA code in my editor, or a value that I'm entering into my Excel worksheet, or the ribbon like now. My goal here is to ensure that everything I type is easy for you to see. The only thing that you have to remember here is that the way that Excel appears on your screen in terms of size may be different from the way that it appears on my screen. That's intentional, so don't worry if things don't look exactly the same. Okay, now that we're zoomed in on the Excel ribbon, I want to hover my mouse here in this green section. You can really hover it anywhere. I'm just going to hover it a little bit over view and right click. You're going to see this small menu pop up, and I want to select the option Customize the Ribbon. This will bring up a little Excel options dialog box, which essentially allows us to modify what groups, what commands, and what tabs appear on my main Excel ribbon. On the right side here, where it says Customize this ribbon, and by the way, if you don't see this screen, make sure you're on Customize Ribbon right here on the left. On the right side here, we can find the Developer tab, and we want to make sure that we select it right here. As soon as we select it, that will enable it as soon as we click OK. And once I activate that, Developer pops up at the very end of our ribbon. I can click it, and here we go, our now exposed Developer tab. The last thing I want to do in this lesson is offer a brief rundown of some of the most popular commands on the Developer tab. We're going to be diving into all of these in a lot greater detail over the course of the next couple lessons, so don't worry if something doesn't make sense now. I assure you it will in time. The very first button we have here to the left is Visual Basic, and this will actually open up the Visual Basic Editor, or the VBE, where we'll be writing the code throughout the course. The shortcut for this is Alt plus F11. To the right, we have a button called Macros. I'm going to press it right now. This is going to bring up the macro dialog box, which is going to show us all macros that we have written that are public. Public means that they are exposed to the Excel interface so that a user can use them. There are going to be a lot of options here for things like editing the keyboard shortcuts for a macro, running it, or even executing it step by step. Predictably, we don't actually have any macros listed here because we haven't written anything, but once we write a macro, they're all going to populate here in this list. Next up is the Record Macro button on the top here. As it turns out, Excel has a built-in feature called the Macro Recorder, and it's kind of amazing when you first hear about it. What the Macro Recorder does is generate automatic VBA code for you. Essentially, you take actions on the worksheet. You take regular actions like clicks and typing, and the Macro Recorder understands what you're doing and generates relevant VBA code. The question you might be asking is, well, if this feature exists, why the heck do we have to learn VBA? The answer is that the macro recorder tends to be very inefficient and error-prone. Many times it writes more code than is required. Many times it doesn't use the right kind of idea when accomplishing a task. It'll get the task done, but it won't do it in the most logical manner. There are a lot of minor quirks and inefficiencies with the macro recorder, so we should never use it as a final solution when it comes to creating a macro, but it can serve as a really great resource for generating code that we can look at just to get a general sense of how things work within Excel. Right below Record Macro, we have a Use Relative References button. This is related to the macro recorder, and it tracks how references are treated when there is a macro being recorded. By references, I mean how Excel interprets movements within the workbook. For example, if I have my mouse in cell A1 and I move into cell B3, there's two ways that you can interpret that movement. The first is to say, oh, he literally moved to cell B3. The other way to interpret that movement is he moved 2 cells down and 1 cell to the right. The two conditions that I described there are called absolute and relative references, and that option has to deal with how the macro recorder is going to treat your movements like that. We're going to dive into that in much greater detail later on. Finally, we have this macro security button. That's going to bring up our Trust Center options, which deals a lot with macro security. We're going to cover that in a few lessons, so no need to worry about it now. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. The last thing I want to do, I've been saving this moment up until the end. Let's go ahead and actually open our VBE, our Visual Basic Editor. So I'm going to click the Visual Basic button right here on the left, and we have this thing pop up. This is the Visual Basic Editor. This is where we're going to be writing all of our code throughout the course. Now, this is a completely separate application. It is connected to Excel, but it is running in its own separate window with its own separate memory. And I can imagine how this new Visual Basic Editor might be a lot to take in. There's a whole new system of toolbars and menu options. We see this project pane, we see this properties pane, we see this immediate pane. In fact, your screen configuration may be different than mine. It may look a little bit different. That's all totally okay. It's totally fine if you don't know any of this. We're going to dive into all of these details over time. What I recommend you do now, though, as an experiment is just to poke around here a little bit. Spend some time clicking around the menus, click some of the available options up here, maybe hover your mouse over some of these buttons and read the tooltips. Try to get a general sense of what's going on here. It doesn't matter if you understand everything. I just want you to be a little bit more comfortable on the general structure of how the VBE looks, because it is a little bit different compared to Excel. It is a little bit more outdated, a little bit more like a classic Windows application. It's not so stylish and filled with color. So just get used to kind of moving around this interface and get comfortable with it. And in the next lesson, we're going to start our actual setup for the course, and we're going to discuss Excel file types. So I'll see you there. In this lesson, I want to talk about the different file types available in Excel. As it turns out, the default Excel file extension, XLSX, does not actually support macro code. So we'll need to save our workbooks in a specified file type in order to ensure that our code is preserved and that it can run the next time we open the workbook. On my screen here, I have a brand new unsaved Excel workbook. So let's go ahead and get to the save prompt. I'm just going to press the keyboard shortcut Control+S. That'll bring us to the Backstage view. And in this case, I'm just going to select anything that's going to bring up the save prompt. We're not actually going to be saving, so it doesn't matter right now. I'm just going to bring up the VBA course folder on my desktop where I asked you to unzip all of the course files. Right down here, we'll see this option, Save as Type, and you can see the option that's listed here is Excel Workbook. That is the standard default file type, and in this standard default file type, macros are actually prohibited. It looks like right here, Excel is actually omitting the extension here, but the extension for an Excel workbook, a plain one, is XLSX, and it is no good. If we write our macro code in here and then we save it, Excel will give us a warning that says, hey, you're trying to save macro code in here, I don't support it. If you for some reason ignore that warning, which is highly likely because many times we just kind of save and click yes and don't actually read the prompt on the screen, if we accidentally save code in a regular Excel workbook, the next time we open it, the code will be completely gone and all of our work will be lost. So it's very important that we save our work in the proper format. If we select this dropdown, what we really want to do is always save our workbooks, at least in this course, in this format, the Excel macro-enabled workbook. This has a file extension of XLSM. You can always think of the M at the end as being short for macro. These macro-enabled workbooks are identical to the regular plain Excel workbooks. They look exactly the same. They have all the same functionality. The only difference is that they allow macros to be written and preserved. We're going to be sticking with this file format throughout the entire course. So there is one thing we can do to simplify the process of choosing this option as the default save type. Otherwise, every single time you'll save a workbook, it's going to default to Excel workbook and you might not properly save it in the right format. It's a little bit of a hassle to keep selecting the right choice. With that said, if you're using Excel for other reasons outside this course, you may not want to select this one as the default. So what I'm about to show you is an optional setting. This is setting the default file type as XLSM. You don't have to do this, but it's going to help make the course a little bit easier and make sure that you don't have to remember to do this every single time we save a file. I'm going to quit out of my Save As window right here. Let's just click Cancel. And on the left side of my Backstage window, we have this Options option. Let's select it. This is going to open up this Excel Options pane. It looks like it took me back to Excel as well. And on the left side here, I have Save. I want to select that. And right here, we see Save Files in this format, and the default XLSX extension is listed here. That's the Excel workbook. So if we want to change the default save type, we simply click this, select Excel Macro-Enabled Workbook, and click OK. And that will, from this point forward, if I try to save again, ensure that the right file format is listed. Here we go. I just brought up the Save As window, and we can see it says Macro-Enabled Workbook. Now, this is a global Excel setting, but you can go ahead and change it back if you ever need to. Again, if you're using Excel for other reasons and you don't want to accidentally save your workbooks as macro-enabled workbooks, you might not want to choose this optional setting. But if you want to add a little bit of efficiency to your progression throughout the course, this might be worth taken some time to enable. That's all there is to cover here. The key takeaway is all workbooks that have macro code must have the Excel SM extension, which is depicted here with the file type Excel macro-enabled workbook. In this lesson, I want to talk a little bit about macro security. So why do we need security in the first place? Well, macros have access to parts of our Windows computer, like the file system. They need this access in order to be able to perform certain functionalities. For example, VBA can be used to open an Excel file. In order to open an Excel file, you need to be able to find it on the file system in order to open it. So these permissions are a good thing for us developers, but they have been exploited by malicious hackers in the past. In fact, viruses have been packaged directly within Excel macro files, and they're particularly dangerous because the user does not necessarily need to run a macro or a procedure in order for this virus to spread. A macro can automatically start running in the background when a workbook opens, which makes an Excel workbook a really dangerous way to distribute a virus, especially across multiple file systems. So to solve this problem, Microsoft introduced several security features way back in Excel 2007. Most importantly, whenever the user opens a workbook that has macros, they're going to be prompted with a yellow notification bar. That bar says essentially, hey, this workbook has macros. Do you want to enable them to run? By default, it's going to prohibit any of them from running. So the user kind of has this wall where they have to confirm that they trust the workbook, that it came from a trusted source in order to permit the macros to run. So right here on my desktop, I have a file here called file with macros, and I've put a macro in here. The macro doesn't really do anything important. It doesn't really matter at all what it does. As long as there's any VBA code in a workbook, we're going to see this yellow notification bar when I open the file. Let's take a look. I'm going to open Excel, and when Excel opens here it is, a yellow bar that says security warning, macros have been disabled. So macros cannot run, including those automated ones that I talked about a few moments ago. Only when we click enable content are all the macros going to be enabled, and only then can we run them. So where is this security option actually configured? Well, if we go to the developer tab and click on macro security, we're going to get this trust center dialog box that pops up. And here under macro settings, here's where that setting is actually configured. We have 4 total options available to us here. The standard default one is disable all macros with notification, and that's exactly what we're seeing. All macros are disabled, but the user is notified, and once the user gives permission by clicking enable content, then the macros are enabled. The option above is to disable all macros without notification. That means that all macros will be completely prohibited from running. The user is not even going to get a notification. Obviously, this option is not going to work for us in this course because then we won't be able to execute our macros. So this option is no good for us. Right below here, we have an option, disable all macros except digitally signed macros. Now, this is a feature that's more designed for people, or developers rather, who like to sell their code, who like to package their VBA code in something like a plugin or an add-on to add additional functionality to Excel. What they can do is register an account with Microsoft and provide essentially a token of authenticity that whenever you open their plugin or their program, Microsoft confirms that the code has not been tampered with, that it's authentic, that the developer is a valid contributor to their program, and kind of verify it through this digital signature, if you will. Now, of course, this is too long of a process for us. We just want to start coding automatically. We don't want to register with Microsoft. We don't want to start selling our code to other people. So this option is a little bit more complex for us, and we won't need it as well. Finally, the 4th option here is to enable all macros. And immediately to the right here, in parentheses, we actually have it written, not recommended, potentially dangerous code can run. So this is very dangerous because, as I mentioned, if a macro includes some kind of malicious content, it can run automatically and infect our file system. So this default option, disable all macros with notification, what we see here is what we're actually going to be keeping throughout the course. There's just one problem, and that is that it's very, very annoying. This means that whenever you open a workbook, for example, something that you downloaded from me as part of the course files, or even your own workbook sometimes if you, for example, move directory or download it from some kind of online storage system, you're always going to be greeted with this yellow notification bar, and it can get pretty annoying. Sure, you can always just click enable content and move on, but all of those little seconds add up and you're going to waste a lot of time. So what we're going to be looking for here is a compromise that maintains this security setting such that if we get some kind of brand new workbook that we're unfamiliar with, we're going to prevent all the macros from running. But what we also want to do as part of the compromise is ensure that we don't see the security notification bar for any one of our own files, the files that we trust. When we write our own code, we're obviously not going to put anything malicious on our own computer. So we can essentially say that we want to trust our own files. How can we do that? The way we do that is with a feature called Trusted Locations. It's available right here. It's the second tab right here in the Trust Center. A trusted location is essentially a folder or a directory on your computer that we label as safe or trusted. So any Excel macro files or macro workbooks that we put in these locations will be trusted. And when Excel opens them, it's not going to give us this security warning. And that's a good thing because whenever we have a file in any other folder, we're still going to get this security warning, which is a good thing. For example, our downloads folder where we download other people's files can always give us this reminder because it's going to follow the regular global setting of presenting the notification. But any folders that we put here, we can put all of our macro workbook files in there, and that way we can avoid this warning and reduce all of that redundant clicking. So how can we set this up? Well, I'm going to click Add New Location here. That's going to bring up this pop-up box, and I'm then going to click Browse. That's going to bring up the standard browse view in Windows. And what I want to do here is navigate to wherever I'm going to be storing all of the course files. That includes both the files you downloaded from me and all of the files that you'll be saving yourself. Because of course, the best practice here, the best recommendation is to follow along and actually write this code yourself. So what I recommend is to put all of your content just on the desktop. Here I have a sample folder called VBA course. Within it, I have all of my directories that store all of the sections of the course as well as all of the files within them. So I recommend just making a general folder on the desktop. You can call it whatever you want. I called mine VBA course, and then I'm just going to click OK. It doesn't have to be on the desktop. It doesn't have to be called VBA course. Just make sure you have one folder in a specific directory, and then you can locate it and select it. Once it's selected, you're going to see the path to it listed right here. And there's one more thing I want to check in this box, which is subfolders of this location are also trusted. What that means is that whenever we have subfolders or directories within this folder, any files within there will also be considered trusted. If we don't check this box, that only means Excel files at the top level within the actual folder are going to be the ones that are trusted, and we're going to ignore any of the files that are nested within other folders. We want to make sure that everything is covered no matter how many layers down we go, and this option will ensure that happens for us. So once that's selected, we can click OK. I can see here that that path for me has appeared here in my list. We also have the date that it was added, and now this path, this folder, is considered safe. So any Excel files that we have in there are going to be considered trusted. So when I click OK, what I can actually do is compare and contrast. Here we have an example where the notification bar is appearing, and that's because the file as it currently sits is on our desktop. Well, here I have my VBA course folder, which is now safe. So what I can do is drag this file into my folder. And now when I open this file, we're going to see a big difference, which is the notification bar is now gone and the macros are automatically enabled, and we can now run them with whatever we want to do. There's keyboard shortcuts we can use to run macros. We can run them directly from a macros dialog box, etc. But they're all enabled, and we don't have to go through the hassle of clicking that enable content button. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. We talked about how macros can potentially be used to deliver malicious viruses to our computer. So we talked about some of the security configurations that are available. By default, Excel will offer you a notification that says, hey, this workbook has macros. Do you want to enable them? We saw that it was pretty helpful for files that we're unfamiliar with, but it's going to become a hassle throughout the course whenever we're opening our own files. So in order to find a nice compromise between security and comfort, we set up a trusted location on our computer. For me, it was the desktop, and a trusted location is just a folder that Microsoft will not worry about whenever we are opening a workbook file. It's automatically going to assume that the file is trusted, and we don't have to confirm each time we've opened the file in that folder that it's a safe and trusted file that doesn't have any bad content for us. That's all there is to cover here. In the next lesson, we'll be taking a look at the macro recorder. I'll see you there. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the macro recorder, which is one of the most powerful features available to us in Excel. So the macro recorder actually allows us to generate VBA code automatically. What we do is we run the recorder, and then we do regular Excel operations. We can enter values into cells, we can highlight them, color them, delete columns, delete rows, generate pivot tables, etc. And the macro recorder observes our actions, and it translates those actions and those keystrokes and those mouse clicks into valid VBA code. So you may be thinking, what's the point of learning VBA if the computer can automatically write it for us? Well, the macro recorder is functional, but it's also flawed, inefficient, and really prone to error. So it should never really be used for real macros. However, it's a really great resource for learning and exploring the syntax of the VBA language, because whenever you don't know how to do something, but you know how to do it in Excel in the main interface, you can always just run the recorder, execute that process, and then take a look at how it would handle that procedure, how it would generate that code. That code is not guaranteed to be perfect. It's actually quite likely that it's going to have a lot of flaws and inefficiencies, but it's going to give you a foundation for understanding the general gist of things, which is why the macro recorder is not just a tool for beginners, it's a tool that's used by professional VBA developers as well. Excel has a lot of moving parts to it, including VBA, so it's a really great tool for understanding some of those foundations whenever you're diving into something new. So here's how we can record a macro. On the Developer tab, there is a button here called Record Macro, and when we click that, we're going to have this Record Macro dialog box pop up. There are 4 options available for us here, and I want to dive into each one by one. The first one at the very top is macro name, which is a mandatory field, and here's where we want to assign a macro, our macro an actual name. And ideally, that name should be descriptive. It should describe what the macro is doing. So the default naming scheme here, as you can see, is going to be macro 1, then macro 2, then macro 3, which doesn't really tell us what the macro or procedure is doing. So a good name is descriptive. It usually starts with a verb. It explains what it is that we're going to be doing. What we're going to be actually recording here is just the process of writing our name into a cell and then doing some formatting with it. So I'm going to call this macro write and format name. Now, there are a couple of rules when it comes to macro names. The macro name must start with a letter. So here I'm starting it with a capital W. It cannot be a cell address, which means you can't call a macro something like A1. A macro name also cannot be longer than 256 characters. You really should never need that many because you want your names to be as short and sweet as possible. And your macro names also cannot contain spaces. So notice what I've done here is use something called camel case formatting. A camel case formatting is where you capitalize the first letter of each word. We can't have spaces, so how can we distinguish where one word ends and the next one begins? We simply capitalize the first letter of each word. That's called camel case formatting, and that's what a lot of VBA developers use due to the constraint of not being able to use spaces. The next thing we have here is shortcut key, which is an optional keyboard shortcut that we can set for this macro. So we can always run this macro from a list of macros in a dialog box, but we can also configure it to automatically run whenever we press something on the keyboard. So there is one big caveat that we have to watch out for here. Many of the keyboard shortcuts in Excel that involve just the control key plus some kind of letter are already taken. For example, control plus S is save, control plus B is bold, control plus I is italic, control plus O is open. So if we just put a regular letter here, it's very likely that we're going to overwrite one of those existing keyboard shortcuts. Now that is not going to break Excel. It's only limited to this workbook. So if you open any other workbook, those keyboard shortcuts will work just fine. However, you never really want to overwrite those shortcuts because they're really part and parcel of Excel and many people use them. So we never really want to replace an existing shortcut. So we want to have some kind of solution here where we're guaranteed not to overwrite something that already has a keyboard shortcut. The way we do that here is by always including Shift in our keyboard shortcut. If we do Control plus Shift plus some kind of letter, those combinations are not taken up by Excel. So for example, let's say I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Control plus Shift plus W. I know that's not going to be taken. So what I can do here is just click into this box, hold Shift, press W, and we're going to set up that as the keyboard shortcut once this macro is recorded. The next option we have here is where we want to actually store this macro. We have 3 options available here. We're going to stick with the default one, which is this workbook. It's going to save the macro code in what's called a module that's going to be directly connected to this workbook. So we're not going to be able to access this macro from any other Excel file. It's going to be tied to this one. Another option is new workbook, which is automatically going to create a new workbook as soon as the macro is done recording and store our code there. And finally, the third option is this personal macro workbook. The personal macro workbook is a hidden file that is opened whenever you open Excel. Whenever any file is opened in Excel, Excel loads this personal macro workbook. So whenever you want to use a macro across every workbook, whenever you have some kind of functionality that is common, for example, you may want to have a common styling across all of your workbooks. You like a certain font at a certain size with a certain bolding. you can store that macro in a personal macro workbook, and then it'll be available no matter what workbook you're in. It's not tied to any workbook. It kind of exists in this global scope, this global space where you can rely on it from any workbook. We don't need to do that here because this code is really going to be strictly limited to this lesson, so we don't need to make it global and available everywhere. So I'm just going to stick with this workbook for now. This option, by the way, is required, as is the macro name. The shortcut key is optional, and our final field, description, is also optional. And description, of course, is where we can offer an optional explanation for what the macro does. This is really helpful if someone else is going to be taking a look at the macro code later. They can see a brief comment or a brief description about what it's doing. So right here, I'm just going to write what this macro is going to do. We're going to be writing our name to cell A1 and then just formatting it with a couple aesthetic flourishes. So I'm just going to write a description of write name to cell A1 and format it. All right. Now here's where we have to be really, really careful, because as soon as I press OK, this macro is going to be recording. And that means that anything we do in the workbook, anything, whether we move to one cell, if we bold something, if we delete something, any kind of operation like saving, all of those steps are going to be recorded. The macro recorder is sort of like a video camera that's watching everything we're doing and is kind of recording it to cassette and then replaying it whenever we run the macro again. So we have to be really careful, because if we make some kind of mistake, the recorder has no clue that that's a mistake. It thinks it's just a regular action. So we have to be very careful and make sure that we're executing the steps in their proper order and doing everything correctly as soon as we press OK. So let's get started. I'm going to click OK. And now the macro is recording. There's two ways that we know that it's recording. The first is this thing is going to change to stop recording, and that, of course, is a button that we can click whenever we're done with all of the steps that we want to take. The second place where we can stop the recording is down here. We're going to see this square, sort of like a stop button, if you will, and this is going to also stop recording. You can see the pop-up tooltip says a macro is currently recording. Click to stop recording. So right now I haven't done anything, but if I do anything at this point, it's going to constitute the code in our macro. So here's what I want to do. The first thing I want to do is to click into cell A1, and then I'm just going to write my name in here. You can write your name or whatever you'd like. So as soon as I type my name in, what I'm actually going to press here is going to be Control plus Enter. That's going to allow us to enter the value but stay in the exact same cell. So it's not going to move down. So Control plus Enter is going to enter the value, stay in the same cell. Right now, let's go ahead and add some artistic flourishes to the cell. So the first thing I'm going to do is bold the cell. I can do that with Control B. So Control B. I'm then going to change the font. So let's go to the Home tab right here on the ribbon. Let's change the font to my favorite font, Comic Sans MS. You can, of course, choose whatever font you'd like yourself, Comic Sans MS. And let's also change the font size to 24. Let's do one more thing. Let's add a background to the cell. That's the paint bucket icon right here. This yellow color is totally fine. Let's just click that. And let's say this is our favorite format. This is how we like our name to appear on every professional corporate report that we're going to be submitting to our boss. So we're done recording the macro. Let's call it a day. So let's go to the Developer tab and click Stop Recording. And that's it. Our macro is now recorded. It's stored. We don't actually see the code yet. We're going to explore it in just a second. But all of those steps have been recorded, and we can now replay them from the beginning. So let's go back to a blank spreadsheet. What I'm going to do here is just delete column A to get rid of all the changes that we just did. So highlight that, click delete. I'm just going to click into a random cell. And let's run this macro twice now to make sure it's working. The first way we can run it is from this macros box that we see right here on the Developer tab. When we explored this in the previous lesson, it was actually empty, but now we see we have one macro listed exactly with the name that we gave it, right in format name. It's selected in blue. So we can click this run button, and that's going to execute the macro. So it's going to do all the steps that we did. We clicked into a cell, we put in a value, we bolded it, etc. with the font. It's going to do all those steps from the beginning. So when I click run, there we go. This is exactly where we finished recording the macro. All of those steps have been executed instantaneously. By the way, you can access this macros box that we just saw by using the keyboard shortcut Alt plus F8. That's going to bring it up if you want a shortcut, just a little bit of a quicker way to get there. All right, now let's try activating this macro with the keyboard shortcut that we assigned. So once again, I'm going to delete this column. That's just to make sure that we actually see the results. Otherwise, we wouldn't know that anything has actually changed. So let's go ahead and delete this. And our keyboard shortcut was Control Shift plus W. So I'm going to hold Control, hold Shift, press W. Here we go. There we go. The macro has once again ran, and we are back to where we ended up at. All right, so now the time has come to actually take a look at the VBA code. By all means, don't feel like you have to understand everything that's going on. but it's a good idea to take a look at what we just generated to see how VBA processed all of our actions. So there's two ways that we can get to our code. The first is just clicking the Visual Basic icon to open the Visual Basic editor. We'll get there in a second. And then if we go to macros right here and we select our macros, we can also click edit, and that will launch us automatically into the Visual Basic editor as well. So let's click edit. And here is the Visual Basic Editor. This might be our very first introduction to the VBE, so if this is your first time seeing it, congratulations. This is a totally separate program from Microsoft Excel, and this is where all of our macro code is actually being stored, and this is where the actual macro recorder has placed all of its automatically generated code. So let me go ahead and expand this so we can see it a little bit. And I think this should be our entire macro. That's it. So this is all of the code that's been generated. You can see here a whole bunch of keywords and syntax that you're unfamiliar with. Don't worry, we're going to dive into it later throughout the course, and every single thing is going to be explored in much greater detail. But let me just go through and offer you a bird's eye picture, a big overview of what's going on here. We're creating a macro here, or a procedure called write in format name. Right here we have what are called comments, which are just lines that are ignored by VBA whenever it's running this procedure. And these procedures, of course, are run from top to bottom. So one line is executed at a time, and it just proceeds from the top to the very bottom, one line at a time. These lines are ignored. That's what the apostrophes do at the very beginning. And these are where we actually put the comments. And you'll notice that this is where our actual description is going to be listed, as well as the keyboard shortcut that we defined. So if some other VBA developer is looking at our code later, they can identify how they can actually run this macro with their keyboard. So let's take a look at what we're doing here. Again, very briefly, not an in-depth dive, just a big picture overview. We're selecting a range here. We are navigating to cell A1, which is exactly what we did. Here you can see we're setting the value into the cell. That was my name that I wrote. Here we can see with the bold keyword that I'm actually making that selection, that cell, bold right here. And right here, this is a really, really complex part, but this is the part where we're actually setting the name of the font and the size. You can start to see, hopefully get a sense of how much extra code VBA is generating. This is tying back to that point I made at the beginning of the lesson about all the inefficiencies of the macro recorder. So what we wanted to do here is to actually change the font name and the font size. But VBA doesn't necessarily understand that completely, because it can think of things both in positives and in negatives. So when you're changing the font, you can think of that as a positive change where we're changing something from one value to another. But VBA can also think, hey, whenever you're changing the font, you're not changing the strike-through property, and you're not changing the shadow, for example, and it's preserving all of those things that we didn't change, because it's kind of taking a picture or a snapshot of what that cell looks like at the time, and that includes a lot of things that we're not actually focused on. We didn't really care about the shadow or the strike-through, but VBA recorded the state of that cell at the time, and so it included all of this extraneous extra data in the macro, in the procedure code, that is actually irrelevant to what we wanted to do. It's still functional. We just saw that it properly did everything that we wanted it to do, but it's also recording a whole bunch of extra stuff that we don't need. That's what I meant when I talked about how the macro recorder tends to be inefficient. So here we're changing the name of the font. Here it's Comic Sans MS. And here we can see with the same font, we're also changing the size to 24. And again, whenever we're changing the size to 24, VBA is thinking we're doing a whole bunch of other things, including things that we're not doing. And finally, this section right here is where we're actually setting the yellow background. So all in all, if you take a look from the top to the bottom, this is probably about 25, maybe more, 30, 40 lines of code. And we really don't need this many lines of code in order to do something simple like this. However, if this is your first time ever working around in VBA, you can sort of start to get a sense of how this can be helpful, because you can take a look at syntax like this and say, okay, I don't know anything about VBA yet, but this says font and this says bold, so maybe this has something to do with making the font bold in that specific cell. And so you can use this generated code to kind of train yourself to explore different parts of the syntax, different things that we're affecting, and learn that way, kind of pick things up piece by piece depending on how the macro recorder does it. So again, just because the macro recorder is often criticized and made fun of by the VBA community doesn't mean that it's a weak tool. It's a really, really, really great, powerful, useful tool. It's just a learning tool. It's a foundation for understanding how something might work in VBA, but you shouldn't use it to actually make your final macro, because as we can see here, it tends to be inefficient. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. I'll see you in the next one. In this lesson, we'll discuss the differences between absolute references and relative references. These are two different ways of looking at cell navigation in our Excel workbook, and they greatly affect how the macro recorder is going to interpret all of our navigation. The default setting in Excel is absolute references, which means that macros will note the actual address of the cell that we are navigating to. For example, if I have absolute references enabled, which is default, and I click in a macro into cell B1, the VBA recorder will interpret that as an absolute reference to cell B1. You can think of the word absolute as meaning definite or final or fixed. If somebody tells you, I know I'm 100% absolutely right, you know that they're 100% certain of something. And in this case, it's the exact same kind of idea. The place where we're going to end up, the cell location, the range, is certain. It's guaranteed. It's always the same thing. If we go into cell B1, the macro recorder will treat that as an actual reference to cell B1. In comparison, macros recorded with relative references are relative. They look at navigation as relative to a starting cell, compared to a starting position. While absolute references are more concerned with the final destination, where you end up, relative references are more concerned with how you get there. So the way the macro recorder looks at navigation is in a sequence of steps, like move 2 cells to the right and move 3 cells down. It doesn't matter what the final cell is, it matters the journey of steps to get there, which allows macros that are recorded with relative references to be used in a lot more locations because they're not so constrained, they don't have so many limitations, because they're not bound to ending up in any specific location. The easiest way to demonstrate the difference between these two is to actually record a macro with both. So in this lesson, we're going to record 2 macros, one with absolute references and one with relative references. It's going to be the simplest kind of macro. We're going to put our cell cursor into cell A1, click into there, and in both of our macros, as soon as we start recording, we're going to navigate 1 cell over to B1, enter a value in the cell, and then just end the macro completely. And that's it. So let's begin with absolute references. I'm going to click Record Macro. I'm going to give this macro a name of Move Right Absolute. This is an example of absolute references. Let's click OK right here, and we are actively recording. So I'm going to press the right arrow key on my keyboard to go into cell B1. I'm going to type in a value here, let's say hello, and I'm going to press Control plus Enter to enter the value in the cell without moving. So Control plus Enter, okay, looks good to me. So I'm going to click Stop Recording, and we have our very first macro. Next up is a macro using relative references. So I'm going to delete my value in cell B1. I'm going to navigate back into cell A1. This time, I'm going to enable the Use Relative Reference setting right here. You'll know that it's activated because it's going to have a gray background under the setting. So we're all good here. We can now record a macro with relative references. Let's call this macro Move Right Relative. Let's click OK here. We are now recording. Once again, exact same procedure. Right arrow key to go to cell B1. I'm going to enter the value hello. Control plus Enter. OK, it's entered in the cell. And now I can stop recording. Let's take a look at both of these macros in our actual VBA editor. So I'm going to open up Visual Basic. You can do that right here by clicking this key. And right here under Modules, we're going to have Module 1. That's where all of our macro code will be collected. Let's open that up. These little lines in green are what's known as comments. They are completely ignored by VBA. They're just used to leave notes behind for programmers, and the macro recorder will make a couple of them for us, but they're negligible, so we can go ahead and delete them just to make these macros a bit more compact and readable. So let's delete the ones there, as well as the ones in the second macro below. Let's also buy ourselves some space so we can compare these macros. And here we have it. So I know that some of this syntax is still going to be a bit unfamiliar, but hopefully you'll get the general gist of what's going on here. At the very top, we have our absolute macro, the one recorded with absolute references. And just as I mentioned earlier, notice that all of the cell references, the range references, are definite. They're absolute. They're fixed. The very first line of code here selects the range that encapsulates cell B1, right? A literal reference to B1. This second line of code, which is actually identical between the two macros, simply writes the value hello to that cell. The more important line is the very first one. We're selecting cell B1 explicitly. In comparison, in the relative macro, we are starting at the active cell, which represents the currently activated cell, the one that the user has selected, and we're navigating with this offset method. We're going to dive into that a little bit later, but what it does is it essentially navigates. It moves to somewhere else in the spreadsheet. And this 0, 1 syntax means 0 rows down, 1 column over. So we're moving over relative to our original cell, 1 column over. This syntax right here, range A1, is a little bit confusing because this is a relative macro. It's actually a little bit of what I call that extra useless VBA code that the recorder generates for us. We can actually go ahead and remove this. It's actually a little bit confusing, and the macro will still work regardless. This is much better. So we're starting at an active cell. We're moving over 1 column to the right. We're selecting that cell, and then in that selected cell, we're writing the exact same value, hello. So this one is relative from where we start, and this one will always end up in cell B1. Now let's take a look at how these macros will actually work in our Excel workbook. I'm going to go ahead and delete the value in cell B1. And the important thing here is that I'm actually going to navigate to some random cell in the workbook. It doesn't really matter where. So let's say D6 for me. It doesn't matter where you go. I'm in cell D6. I just want to make sure I want to turn off this reference. It won't really matter because the macro has already been recorded. I just want to go back to Excel's default. Let's go ahead and run our 2 macros in a row. So I'm going to open up my macros dialog box. Here it is. And let's execute move right absolute. When I execute this, we're starting in cell D6, but what happens here? Well, we have our value of hello written in cell B1. Why? Well, because our macro is absolute. So when we recorded it, remember, we literally referenced cell B1. That's how it interpreted our movement 1 cell over. It said to itself, oh, they moved into cell B1, and then they wrote the value hello in there. That's an absolute reference. That's how I'm going to record it. Let's go ahead and delete this value in cell B1. Let's go back into another cell. I'm just going to go into D6 again, just to kind of have an equal experiment set up. But this time, when I execute a macro, I'm going to execute move right relative. Let me just move this box a little bit out of the way here and execute this. And now we're going to end up in cell E6. Why? How come when we recorded the original macro, it was cell B1, but now we're in E6? The answer, of course, is because of relative references. Relative references don't care about the final destination. They're recording relative to where we started from. So when we started in cell A1, relative references interpreted cell B1 as 1 cell to the right. So when we started the macro from cell D6, it once again applied the same methodology, 1 cell to the right, then write the value hello, and thus the value ended up in cell E6. To summarize, absolute references target a specific cell, a specific location, while relative references target a cell relative to a starting position. And as much as it may seem like a small difference, it actually has a huge impact on how successful a macro can run. You really have to know which option you should use if you're going to be using the macro recorder. But that's all there is to cover in this lesson. I hope you're excited to tackle your very next challenge. In this lesson, I want to show you an example of how absolute references can lead to a macro not functioning as expected. So let's begin by creating a sample data set. I'm just going to do a column of regular numbers. So I'll begin with a number 1 in A1, a number 2 in A2. I'm going to select both of these values and just drag them down, let's say to row number 24. All right, so we have a list of numbers. Now what I'm going to do is to delete every 5th row, so every 5th value rather. So I'm going to click on number 5, let's delete number 5, number 10, number 15, and number 20. Let's say this represents a collection of 5 different data sets. We have a spreadsheet, let's imagine it's much bigger than this, that just has a collection of data every 4 rows and then a blank line. And our goal is to remove every one of those blank lines step by step. The goal of this macro is for us to click into the top cell of any 4 cells that have data, so maybe number 1 or number 6 or maybe number 11, and have a macro that when executed moves 4 rows down and deletes the row that is blank, which is always going to be 4 down from where we're starting, right? So I want to be able to click into, let's say 6 right now, run the macro, have this row be deleted, click into, let's say 16 right here, run this macro and have row 20 be deleted. Focus on the row that is 4 down from where we're starting and just delete that row entirely. Let's see what happens when we record a macro to do this with absolute references and then with relative references. So I'll click into cell A1. Let's click record macro. Let's call our macro here absolute delete. absolute references are enabled by default, so we can click OK. First thing I'm going to do here is to right click on row number 5, click delete, then put my cursor back into cell A1 and finally stop recording. Pretty simple macro. Right here in my modules folder in my Visual Basic Editor, I'll have a module 1 module. Let's open that. And here we see the automatically generated macro. In fact, let me go ahead and delete these comments so we can read it a little bit easier. So we can take a look at what's going on here. 3 lines, pretty simple. First step is we're selecting row number 5. And this actually is going to be where our problem is going to occur, because we can see that row number 5 is absolutely referenced. It's explicitly written down that it's row number 5. So no matter where we run this macro from moving forward, if we, for example, want to run this macro right here on row 15, what's actually going to happen is the first line is automatically going to select a row number 5, this one. And the next line of code is with the selection, which represents our row, we're going to delete it and shift all of these cells up. This is where everything is going to go wrong, because rather than deleting the 5th row below from where we're starting, we're automatically going to delete row number 5. So for example, let's say I start right here in cell A5, and I think I'm going to delete this row below, row number 9. When I execute this macro by going to macros, finding this absolute delete macro, clicking run, well, we can see things don't go as expected. We actually lose a value. That value is number 6. It's now completely gone. It was in the position of row number 5. It's been deleted. It's now lost. Our macro isn't working as expected because of absolute references. So this is how absolute references can lead us astray. So now let's take a look at how we can fix this problem using relative references. The first thing I want to do is to bring our data back into its original shape. So I'm going to highlight all of the values below. Let's once again create a little bit of a longer data set right here. So let's just drag it down to row 24. Let's delete lines 5. Let's do row 10, row 15, and row 20, all of the 5s. Once again, let's place our cursor in cell A1. The thing I want to do here, of course, is to enable relative references. So I have to click this button again. It's on the Developer tab on the code group on the left. Now we can record our macro. So let's click Record Macro. That brings up the Record Macro dialog box. Let's call this macro relative delete. Once again, no shortcut, no description, doesn't matter for now. As soon as I click OK, everything is being recorded, so we have to be very careful with all of our steps. I'm going to repeat the exact same steps that I did last time. Right click on row number 5, click delete, click back into cell A1. Let's stop recording the macro. All right, so there's our code on the right side. Let me go ahead and once again remove the comments. Let me also scroll up so we can see the difference between what's going on here. So as a reminder, the syntax here is not incredibly important. I know that this is a lot of code to take in, so it doesn't really matter if everything is understandable. We can take a look at the difference between these two macros above and below each other. In the absolute macro, we're selecting row number 5 all the time. Here you can see what we're doing is where we have the active cell, which represents the cell that's currently selected or active on our spreadsheet, we're moving down 4 rows. That's what offset does. You don't have to memorize this right now because we're going to dive into it much later. But essentially what we're doing here is no matter where we are in the spreadsheet, we're moving 4 rows down dynamically from that cell. That cell could be anywhere. It can be cell A1, it could be cell G7, it can be cell Z26. It doesn't matter. We're moving 4 rows down. We're selecting that entire row. We can see that with entire row right here. And that selection is what's actually being deleted. You can see selection delete with the shift right here, XL up, is the exact same line as we have right here. So the deletion step is exactly the same. The difference is in what is actually being selected for deletion. In the absolute macro, it's always row number 5. In this one, it's a relative row. It's the row that is 4 down from where our original cell is, which is exactly what we want. It's relative to where we're starting from. So now, if I click into cell A5, that's the top of a code block or a data block to be more precise. And now I want to delete row number 9 because it's 4 down from where I'm starting. If I go to macros and I execute relative delete, let's click this. Everything works as expected. I've deleted the row that is 4 down from where I'm starting from. So now if I click into this cell, again, that's the top of my next block of data. Once again, go into macros. Once again, execute relative delete. We click run. The next one is deleted. One more time, we're going to click into cell A13. That's the beginning of the next block of 4. Let's go into macros, relative delete run. Everything is working exactly as expected. And if we, of course, had a keyboard shortcut, we can just hold it in place, and that would execute this over and over and over and delete every fifth row automatically. So hopefully this lesson will serve to reinforce the idea of how relative references work. They are relative or based off of where you're starting from. They're dynamically created. Where we're starting from, that cell is used as the basis for figuring out where you're going. So all sequences of movement, whether you're moving up or down or left or right, are interpreted as being relative to that starting point, that starting cell. In comparison with absolute references, everything is absolute. So if you go into cell C3, VBA will look into that as literally cell C3 every single time. In this example, Excel interpreted our deletion of row number 5 as the deletion of row explicitly number 5, specifically row number 5. Not the row that was 4 below where we started from, that's relative, but actually explicitly row number 5. That's what absolute references do. It's absolute, it's predetermined. You can think about what the word absolute means. It means kind of fixed in place. That's exactly how these references work. They're always targeting the exact same location, the same cell, the same column, the same row, etc. Relative references, which is going to be the one you tend to use more often than not whenever you're recording macros, targets things dynamically, which makes it a much more powerful and flexible choice when recording macros. In this lesson, we'll explore the interface of the Visual Basic Editor. As a reminder, there are 2 ways that we can access the VBE. The first is by clicking the Visual Basic button on the Developer tab right here. That will launch us into the VBE. The second is to use the keyboard shortcut from Excel, which is going to be Alt plus F11. If you forget that shortcut, you can simply hover your mouse over this button and it'll appear here in the little highlight that pops up. Alt plus F11. So let's go ahead and click that, and that'll take us into the Visual Basic Editor. So the VBE, or the Visual Basic Editor, is a totally separate program from Excel. It's dependent on it, it needs it to run, but it's a totally separate application in itself. It runs with its own interface, its own set of toolbars, its own set of settings. So you can imagine them as 2 separate entities. Because the VBE is designed for more technically oriented people, the programmers and developers and the like, its interface certainly isn't as pretty as Excel's, but you'll find as you play around with it that it's still pretty simple and pretty functional. So let's explore the different parts of the VBE, starting with this top left section, which we call the Project Explorer. The Project Explorer window is typically placed on the top left, but you can go ahead and click this bar and drag this window and dock it anywhere you want in the actual window that we see here, the VBE. The Project Explorer lists all open workbooks and add-ins sort of as a tree diagram with nodes. It's very similar to what you might see in Windows Explorer when you're looking at directories and all the files within them. It's kind of a nested structure that stores the logic of all of the objects that are within the spreadsheet. What I mean by objects are all of the data entities within every workbook. So right here at the very top, we have our VBA project, which represents the currently open workbook, absolute versus relative references. This is the exact same workbook that I worked with in the last lesson when I created the automatically generated code. Below, we have a folder called Microsoft Excel Objects, and that's going to store an object, or essentially a data structure, to represent every single worksheet. Right now in this workbook, I only have one worksheet. It's called Sheet 1, so here it is right now highlighted in blue. But if I had more worksheets, they would all be listed here kind of as a drop-down list. And finally, at the end, I have this workbook, which represents the entire workbook as a whole. Now, primarily, most of the code that we're going to be writing in the course is going to take place or be written in modules. And so modules are organized still within the same project, but within a totally separate folder called modules. By default, as we create modules, or as the macro recorder generates them for us, they're going to be named numerically in order. So module 1, module 2, module 3, and so on. But we can go ahead and change the names of these as we proceed if we want to organize related procedures into different modules. So for example, we may have a module for mathematical operations, one for worksheet operations, one for workbook operations, one for specific reports, things like that. It's just a way to organize our code into different buckets. A module, again, is just a container for procedures, and procedures are just snippets of VBA code that perform some kind of operation. All modules will be listed here under the modules folder, and a single module is actually limited to 64,000 characters. We can see here, in order to actually see what's in the module, we can double click it. That's going to open the content in the code editor on the right, and here we see all of the code that's currently saved within this module. It's two procedures for us, this move right absolute and move right relative. As soon as I click on any of these other objects within the Microsoft Excel objects folder, you can see there's no code currently written in there. So whenever we're looking for our code, we have to go to wherever it was originally saved. In this case, it's in module 1. So VBE will open a brand new code window for each module or worksheet that we click. We're going to see all of our code right here. By default, we're going to have these horizontal lines that separate each one of our procedures, so we have a visual indicator of where one ends and one begins. We're going to dive into this option a little bit later. On the top right here in this drop-down, we have the ability to select any one of our procedures to go to the place in the module where it's defined. So right now we only have 2, so it's kind of not really an effective feature because we can see everything on screen. But you can imagine if we have 15 or 20 different procedures in a single module, they're all going to appear right here. We can very easily click on one of them and it's going to bring us to that section of the code. Down here on the left side of the Visual Basic Editor, we have the Properties window. If for some reason you don't see the Properties window, you can always click View up top here, and Properties window will be listed right here. It's also enabled by the keyboard shortcut F4. By the way, if you don't see the Project Explorer, which is the thing on the top left that lists all the modules, that's this thing right here. You can click that as well if for some reason it's disappeared, or use the keyboard shortcut Control+R. It may pop up somewhere else on the screen undocked. If that's the case, just click and grab it and drag it to where you want it to stay on the screen. We'll dive into properties a little bit later in the course, but you can think of properties as configuration settings or options for a specific data entity within our system. So on our module, for example, we only have one property and it's called name right here, and we can use that property to change a specific value. So if we want to change the name of this module, which is currently module 1, we can change it. So for example, we can do something here like deletion procedures. Press enter to save. You can see the name has changed below, and it's also changed up here. So we've used properties to alter the name of the module. It's a little bit more of an advanced concept, but essentially as we click around different objects, we're going to have different settings, different configurations that we can set depending on what the data structure is, depending on what the data entity is, because of course what a workbook can do is different from what a worksheet can do, from what a module can do. So each thing in our application is going to have its own bucket of settings, and the properties window is where we adjust and configure those settings. Finally, down here on the bottom, we have the immediate window. If for some reason you don't see this window, let me just go ahead and close it. The keyboard shortcut for that is Control-G, and the alternative way to access it, I'm just going to close it again, is going to the View, drop down, and there should be an immediate window setting right here. That's the exact same thing. You can see the shortcut. That brings up the immediate window. The immediate window is a console of sorts. It's a playground. That's the best way that I can think of it. It's a place where you can test little snippets of code. So it's not designed for writing an entire procedure from scratch. It's not designed for any kind of lengthy operations. But whenever you want to check how, for example, a single line of code would execute without packaging it within a procedure, without going through that hassle, you can test kind of snippets of code here very briefly. For example, I can perform a basic mathematical calculation or check the current value of a cell in my Excel window. So as an example, we're going to dive into the syntax later, but if I want to find out what 1 plus 1 is, I can place a question mark here. That's sort of asking the immediate window a question. I can put some kind of expression like 1 plus 1, press enter, and get the value of 2. So really simple operations, really simple things that we want to check. One-liners of code, maybe 2 lines at maximum. Whenever we want to test something really small, we use the immediate window. Whenever it's something larger, we're just going to package it within a procedure. We can also use the immediate window, by the way, to check the current values of properties. So we can use it to check current settings, see what they're currently set to, things like that. We're going to dive into that in much greater detail when we explore the immediate window in a section or 2 from now. And that's basically the whole interface of the Visual Basic Editor. There are additional options available right here in all of the drop-down menu options, but we're going to explore those in detail a little bit later. So to close or exit the VBE, it's a totally separate program, so when we close it, it doesn't affect Excel in any way. All we have to do is just click the X button at the top right. That closes us out of the VBE. There is a keyboard shortcut as well, so let me go ahead and open it. The keyboard shortcut to exit the VBE is Alt plus Q. I'm going to press that right now. Brings us back to our Excel interface. So again, we do not we do not need to have the VB running. Excel is a totally separate application. It can run by itself, but when we do have the Visual Basic Editor running, we do need Excel open because it is dependent on it to essentially get its data and manipulate it. So that's a quick exploration of the Visual Basic Editor. It's a lot to take in, but we talked about the Properties window, the Immediate window, the Code Editor, the Project Explorer, and we're going to dive into all of these sections in much greater detail. We're going to explore them one by one, but essentially it's just a way to organize our project. On the Project Explorer, we're going to have all of our available projects, our objects within them. By objects, I mean worksheets, workbooks, etc. In the Properties window, we're going to be able to configure our settings. In the Code Editor, we're going to be able to actually write our code and our procedures. And in the Immediate window, we're going to use it as a console of sorts to test values, do a dry run through certain procedures, test a couple small things here and there, minor operations like that. And that's basically it. Once you memorize those 4 pieces, that's most of the VB interface, and you'll be surprised how quickly you can pick it up. That's all there is to cover here, so I'll see you in the next lesson.